I think it was 1913 that my grandfather returned to Ireland. I think it was just paying a visit with the intention of going back to America, but as I think he said himself, things were hotting up when he got to Ireland in 1913, and he joined the volunteer movement. I think my grandfather was actually quite proud of a raid that he made with he says, a party of IRB men. 100 rifles had been purchased by the Redmond volunteers, and they had been impounded, and there was no way they were going to be released. And they managed to go on a raid to this warehouse and capture the rifles. He says one case was brought to a house in Glasnevin, and every other day he would go to the house and take away a couple of rifles and hide them wherever else. And he was very proud that when that house was raided, there was no rifles got. So as well as taking part in Hoth gun running and Kilcool gun running, that was another raid that he was particularly proud of. Originally, when the rising was being planned, he had been told by Thomas Clark that he was to go to Harcourt Street and cover that area. He was sent there with James Connolly to reconnaissance the area prior to the rising. But as in his witness statement, he details where 2 weeks before the rising, he was called at an all-night dance that they had, which I think was probably more than a dance. It was more like a meeting or a planning for the rising. But he was called over to Patrick Pearse in St. Enda's in Rathfarnham, and Pearse told him he was to take charge of Kildare, which meant he was to go down there and mobilise the volunteers all around County Kildare and bring them to Dublin for the rising, or for the fight. Yeah. From what I know and what I've read, and it's a little bit sad to read, what actually happened, my grandfather should have been taking charge of a couple of hundred men, or even more, but the countermanding order went out on Easter Sunday morning. They read this in the paper, and eventually a word came from Pearse that they were still to go ahead, and he managed to round up 15 volunteers, and they began a march up to Dublin. They stopped at the college in Maynooth, and they were actually blessed by the principal or the vice principal of Maynooth College, and he told them he didn't agree with what they were doing, but he was going to bless them anyway. And another story was actually that there were some RIC men that were in Maynooth town as they were mobilising, and some of the volunteers wanted to shoot them, but I believe my grandfather said no, there was nothing to be gained by killing these men, and they set off on their march along the railway lines and the canal into Dublin. They marched along the railway line, and they actually met people getting off trains coming from the Ferryhouse races, and he says they were in a state of shock, not knowing what these men were doing. But what they did was they marched along the railway line, and they eventually ended up in Glasnevin Cemetery, and he told the men to bed down there for the night. They found a vault somewhere in Glasnevin where they were able to hide their rifles overnight, and he went down into Dublin to see what was happening, and there was a clear path for them, and the next day they marched down into the GPO.
When they arrived at the GPO, they were greeted by Connolly, and to set the scene, one corner was a makeshift munition factory where bombs were being manufactured, rifles repaired, and shotgun shells being loaded. And the Maynooth 15 were given tea and meagre food. Pretty Lucy Smith, one of the Come on the Mon girls, brought Tom Byrne a basin of warm water to bathe his feet and a pair of clean socks.
I'm sure his feet were very tired after walking all the way from Kildare, and she produced a basin of water and a pair of clean socks for him, and they must have known each other then.
I just find that so moving, so tender, showing the qualities of kindness and some of the important qualities, as well as the courage and bravery.
Obviously tried to tied him up a bit, even though it was for a fight, and that was the lady he was going to marry, and it's quite a nice story that they met, at the door of the GPO.
After the rising, my father had to go on the run, I remember my father making his way up to the north, staying in safe houses. My mother spent her time, of course, rearing her family of 4 and raising funds for those of them who were in prison. And father was arrested twice, imprisoned in Frongok in Wales, I think, and Wormwood Scrubs, and the Curragh. And I remember a friend of his, he told me, asked him, and where were you in 1798? And he said, I missed that one.